Without further ado, I would like to introduce Bokang Po, Senior Program Manager of Steve Biko Foundation in South Africa, who will be moderating our keynote address with Dr. Saths Cooper. Bokang is currently the Senior Program Manager at the Steve Biko Foundation and is based in the Eastern Cape and Johannesburg, Gauteng, and Quants in the Eastern Cape province. Prior to joining Steve Biko Foundation, she worked at the British Council as a project manager in the areas of community development, basic education, further education and training, arts and culture, and the creative economy. Her roles have equipped her with training, financial management, impact assessment, and strategic communication. She volunteered at the Steve Biko Center and developed monitoring and evaluation systems for arts and culture, dialogue and education programs. Bokang became a full-time staff member supporting the Resource Mobilization Department and would later lead the Programs Department. She's most proud of her contribution to streamlining administrative processes and building the necessary strategic partnerships for the Foundation's success. In 2019, Bokang was selected to participate in the U.S. Embassy International Visitors Leadership Program for emerging leaders in the nonprofit sector. The experience further solidified her interest in developing sustainable communities through various interventions. Bokang has studied towards an accounting degree at the University of Johannesburg. She has completed courses in project management, monitoring and evaluation, and strategic communication. She is currently studying towards a digital communication strategy certificate. So Bokang, it's my pleasure to give you the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you, JJ, and thank you to the Sites of Conscience team for trusting me to steer this portion of the workshop. Greetings, colleagues, and welcome to the second day of the Global Workshop on Reckoning with Systemic Racism. In Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon asserts that each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in relative opacity. As the global community goes through an organic moment of assessing the meaning of true humanity, redefining, creating the vocabulary to describe struggles, conscientizing immediate circles of influence and those further afield, it is evident just how urgent it is to zero in and fulfill our respective and common missions. As mentioned yesterday, systemic racism and ethnic discrimination aren't necessarily new. Adam Toledo, Emmett Till, Steve Biko, Collins Khoza, although separated by decades and geography, are all casualties of racist and inhumane policing systems. 1976 June's Soweto uprising, Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, all spoke to the decolonization of our education systems. And thus, the timing and theme of our discussion aligns perfectly with the temperament of the time. People who continue to be relegated to the margins of society in some capacity based on either their skin color and/or ethnicity, gender, or class, are speaking truth to power, re-strategizing and organizing, challenging humanity to play its part, and that definitely includes us as custodians and sites of memory. Our first session of the day is a keynote address titled Confronting Racism for Holistic Liberation, the Black Consciousness Movement. And it will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. The keynote address, as JJ mentioned, will provide a historical overview of the Black Consciousness Movement and how it confronted white supremacy in apartheid South Africa. It will examine Steve Biko's concept of Black consciousness and holistic liberation and its relevance today. Our keynote speaker is the esteemed Dr. Saths Cooper, and I'll read his biography now. Dr. Saths Cooper is a member of the Black Consciousness Movement, activist, psychologist, vice chancellor, and principal of the University of Durban, Westville, South Africa. Saths Cooper is immediate past president of the International Union of Psychological Science, president of the Pan-African Psychology Union, governing body member of the International Science Council, deputy chair of the ISC's Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science, and serves on the board of the South African Broadcasting Corporation, chairing its Public Broadcasting Committee. A close colleague of the late Steve Biko, he was banned and house arrested when he was 22 years of age and jailed for 9 years. He was the first accused in the seminal Sasso BPC trial, which is also called the Trial of Ideas and Culture, in Pretoria from January 1975 to December 1976, spending over 5 years on Robben Island in the same cell block as former President Nelson Mandela, and in 1998 was declared a victim of gross human rights violations by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Nobel laureate Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. Obtaining his PhD in clinical community psychology from Boston University as a Fulbright scholar in 1989, he has been the recipient of many citations and awards, such as the IUCIS's inaugural Achievement Against the Odds Award, the APA Award for Distinguished Contributions to the International Advancement of Psychology, and the inaugural Health Professions Council of South Africa Presidential Merit Award, honoring outstanding achievement in psychology. He is a fellow of the South African, Indian, British, and Irish Psychological Study Societies. A clinical psychologist for over 30 years, Cooper was Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Durban-Westville, now merged with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and is an extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria and honorary professor at the University of Johannesburg. He is in the leadership of the 70s group of activists from the seminal 1970s period, which is anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-sectarian. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Saths Cooper for his presentation.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and I want to greet everyone on this webinar. My presentation, if we can go to the slide, next. It's important, I think, to just point to some of the issues that gave rise to what we confronted in South Africa, the system of apartheid. In 1928, the Carnegie Foundation commissioned a study into the poor white problem, which laid the basis for the apartheid system, privileging white issues over those of the Black majority. Those recommendations became the cornerstones of apartheid, its law, its segregation, and its total exclusion of the Black majority. It laid the foundation for apartheid. Next. I'm going to deal with a few areas raised by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Next. That picture that you saw was of Nobel laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu. On the 29th of October, 1998, this TRC report was finalized, and it's significant in many respects because it enabled all sides in the struggle against apartheid and during apartheid to come clean on what they did. It's arguable whether the TRC succeeded or not, but this is not the place for that. In its report, it pointed out that the system of apartheid could only have continued if large numbers of white people, the minority in the country, now constituting hardly 9%, if large numbers of them who were enfranchised and privileged in the South African context condoned or simply allowed it to continue. We know also from other historic examples and current day examples that the majority of those who enjoy privileges tend not to recognize at whose cost those privileges have been gained and tend to actually react against any attempt to point out what is truly happening. And you find that victimizers act as victims in that situation. And nowhere has it been more apparent than over the last year in the United States with the murder of George Floyd and the research emerging from credible mainstream sources in the United States, pointing out that there is a decline in white awareness in the United States. Now, that kind of denialism is what South Africans have been confronting, not only during the period of apartheid, but in the 27 years of democracy, where the majority will decry any knowledge of what happened. And they will also quickly say they grew up to respect and regard everyone as equal. And then they'll add, I don't see color, whether it's black, white, blue, green, yellow. And they add some of those colors almost into what happens in the environment rather than the issue that they often try to shy away from, and that is the external pigmentation and external appearance of people. So how then to overcome that system? The TRC said it depends on our ability to examine with honesty and with humility the role we have played in the past, and more importantly, what role we can as individuals and institutions play in the future. Now, in that lies a lot of part of the solution. If we want to really engage authentically with one another about the issues that confront us in our common space, the world we inhabit, then it requires us to look at the past and ensure that what's happening in the present does not continue into the future. Unfortunately, many of us, particularly in the global north and in OECD wealthy countries, have taken human rights for granted, paying lip service to them, and thus becoming accustomed, indeed, denying and often trying to cover up oppression, exclusion, and inequity. Next slide. In South Africa and in parts of the world that many of you come from, there's race classification and thinking in terms of race, and also associated with that is the fear of losing oneself. In South Africa, what we confronted was a veritable pall of fear that had engulfed the community, and most people experienced a terror. The very walls had ears. There was a blanket of fear engulfing all of the country. And what we had was a system of psychological combat. The Black majority tended to know its place and conformed to those requirements of the apartheid system. Indeed, in the early days, you could not walk on the same sidewalk with a white person. You had great segregation, and until the 90s in this country, nearly all of the country was segregated on racial lines. Much of that spatial geography still persists. In such a situation, the white minority quickly accepted a false, artificially contrived sense of their own superiority and the power that they enjoyed in the society. I need to state right out, and this is something that in all probability resulted in the terrible beating and murder of Steve Biko. I've never come across a racist, and it's usually a he, who did not try to hide the insecurity and uncertainty he felt. Beneath the huge, strong, burly exterior of whiteness lay a small inferior being, bereft of any sense of self-respect. And self-respect is very important for other respect. If you do not have self-respect, you will not have other respect. That sense of actualization being threatened in a diverse society. And in essence, their very being in the world begins to be threatened. Next slide. So when, as university students in the late 60s and early 70s, we confronted segregated institutions. You could not attend institutions except those that were reserved for you. And most of the universities were white, a smaller number were black. Completely bizarre picture that confronted a majority situation. So we felt that there was something definitely wrong with that picture. And our engagement resulted in formation of the South African Students Organization, where we decided that as fellow Black students, as fellow oppressed, we should come together to discuss and take action against what we confronted in our institutions, segregated as they were, filled with fear, nobody wishing to openly discuss political ideas. What you've seen in movies about the Gestapo and the Second World War period was what was experienced in South Africa, where we decided that there needed to be a subjective identification. There needed to be commonality of purpose and vision, rising above the narrow limitations of biology, specifically the amount of melanin in one's pigmentation and the other immediate physical factor of hair texture in some instances. So ascribed culture, language, and ethnicity, all these factors played a role in how the white minority became the power, political and economic, and many respects, the cultural power to determine what was to obtain in the country. So the quest for true humanity through Biko's ideas of Black consciousness has continued to inspire generations, and importantly, what Bogang Pue raised in the introduction, the roads must fall, anti-colonial movement, and the fees must fall, struggles of young people in universities. We decided to rise above the narrow, artificially created external requirements where our biology became important in classification, and where every time in the larger social context, particularly where it involved white involvement, we were often rudely reminded of who we were and limited to an Afrikaans expression, ken jou plek, meaning know your place. Don't rise above that place ascribed to you. Next slide. So Biko's thinking was, despite the abject conditions prevailing, especially for the African majority during the height of apartheid oppression in the society, that we needed to reassert a definition of ourselves by ourselves. And Biko very smartly delved into the Black psyche, trapped within a virulent racist and hostile environment, constantly confronting self, confronting insecurity, uncertainty, and an assault physically and psychologically, that psychological combat which tended to diminish and objectify, and I'll deal with that shortly, that objectification being regarded as a thing, as a commodity. And Black consciousness, Biko said, was not a matter of pigmentation, but a reflection of a mental attitude. And that authentic Black involvement and Black people were those who can manage to hold their heads high in defiance, rather than willingly surrender their souls to the white man. Next. Importantly, being truly Black was a process on what he called the road to emancipation. And that emancipation, importantly, had to be psychological first. And the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, through education, through socialization, through religious scriptures intending to diminish who we were. That road to emancipation was critical. And I'll deal with that very quickly in one of the next slides. This enabled us to emancipate ourselves from any historic determinism in any form, whether overt or covert, which made us become appendages of anybody else, freeing us to live meaningful lives, complete in ourselves, without reference to being white in the world. Next slide. We recognize that many of the issues we confronted in terms of our mental, psychological, spiritual, physical health, social and economic problems were produced by colonialism and its particular expression, apartheid and white racism in our society. In very diverse societies, you'll find those that are at the bottom of the heap, despite probably enjoying majority status in population terms, are repositories for the worst physical and psychological ill health. So Black consciousness placed Blacks at the center of our field of vision, without in any way dissing white people, even if whites were the source of our physical, psychological inferiorization. We positively reframed the misnomer, the usage of Black as something appalling, dark, terrible, evil, and arrogated that term into definition for ourselves, that it was not an aberration from normalcy, where whites and white tended to be the standard by which everyone was judged. Next slide. Othering happens when the other becomes an object, a system that I call reification, from the Latin word reus, meaning thing. And as I pointed out earlier, if you have no self-respect, if you have no sense of your own self as part of the human family, you will not be able to have other respect. Despite your protestations to the contrary, you have difficulty in identifying as part of the human family, and therefore anybody who is diminished, anybody who is looked at as a lesser being, becomes objectified, becomes a thing. The demonizing, the effect of narrow ethnicity, racism, all sorts of bigotry and chauvinism begin to play out in such a situation. And we see that currently in many, many societies where we have inordinate levels of youth disaffection, societal insecurity and uncertainty, huge levels of violence in terms of type and extent in terms of the ferocity of that violence, and wide-scale civil strife, often unexpressed, exists in many of our countries. Often it's largely fueled by a narcissistic, mediocre leadership, where there's a colossal failure in their ability to portray a vision that ensures everybody who's a human being is part of that society. There begins to be a disjunct then between what a leader says and does and what his followers take as examples to carry out the worst kind of bigotry and attack on others, as we've seen in the United States, we've seen in various other countries, we're seeing in Israel, in Palestine right now. We also know that many of those leaders are so deeply steeped in corruption, in inability to govern effectively, and they act for their own self-interest. They prevent us acting on behalf of all of us. Next slide. I need to just point out, in the South African context, the terms we confronted were all negatives, and importantly, that term non-white puts white as the stellar example, puts white as the norm against which everybody else should be described. If you remove the word white from the term non-white, you are left with a non. Are we non-entities, nihil, nothing? Are we negatives of white? And that kind of epistemic, deliberate usage of language is intended from birth to keep people in an inferior situation and to not step out of line, to not go beyond that narrow classification of race or whatever else there may be. And we're talking about the kinds of racism that are prevalent in many societies where whites have privilege, where they exercise control at a political, economic, and cultural level. The best that we can do is to ensure that our sense of agency, our sense of integrity and self doesn't continue to be destroyed. That restoration of agency, self, and integrity is critical. And importantly, whites can play a definitive role in talking out against racism, because any ethnic group out there can raise the issues, but unless whites who are progressive stand up and say, this cannot be in my name, I repudiate white racism, that racism will continue. So, as has happened with many companies being called out from the United States through to Europe and to the UK, where huge numbers of slaves were underpinning their commercial interests during times of chattel slavery. Companies have made commitments, but only a fraction of that commitment has seen any realization right now. So when there's noise, when there's a clamor, then all of them want to be seen and heard. And then afterwards, they expect us to forget all that they have been responsible for over generations. Legislation is important, but more importantly is our socialization, educating ourselves about ourselves in order that we can effectively deal with the nightmares of our past to prevent them from continuing into the future. Educating ourselves for liberation, ensuring a fuller understanding of our common issues, and importantly, our common humanity, requires us to act together to change our mindsets. If we don't change our own mindsets, we're unable to change mindsets of others, and to dispel acquired behaviors over generations from colonial into more recent times. We need to free ourselves from the imprisonment of socio-political traps of the past, and importantly, that still reside in our minds. And often because we choose to mediate our physical existence without bothering too much about the cost of how we mediate that physical existence. Next. Restoring, defending our common humanity is what I believe the ISC that you represent, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, all the various organizations that are part of the ISC are about. And in doing that, we should always be aware that how we treat the worst off amongst us actually reveals our own claim to being part of humanity. The question that we must ask is, can we rise above the marks of our origin and those objective conditions that we have found ourselves in to engage in realities meaningfully that are beyond our usual experiential base? Can we debunk our socialization? In that route lies engendering compassion for self and others. We need to contribute meaningfully in the quest for cohesive societies that go beyond the narrow confines of tribe, ethnicity, language, belief. And being part of a common human family. We need to protect our fragile world, to change, to acknowledge and celebrate diversity, because it would be a very dull world indeed if all of us looked the same, spoke the same, and thought the same. That diversity is what makes humanity so great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for that presentation. I see in the attendee section we have one question from Vanessa Adams-Harris, I think. But before we go to Vanessa, I'm going to ask Dr. Cooper to just go into some of the examples of the Black consciousness movement, of exactly how they engaged with the community to give them that sense of agency, to show them that, yes, this is how we are socialized and this is how we've been taught to think of ourselves. But in fact, we are able to do just as well, if not better than what the system is telling us about ourselves.
Yes, we had to, as young people, as students, engage with people around us who continued to believe that they were inferior. And through patient engagement, through attempting to conscientize them to thinking in our way, and eventually, if that failed, to confront them on why they were still remaining in those positions. So it would be in all sorts of contexts, whether it was on a bus, whether it was in a classroom, whether it was in a village, whether it was in the marketplace, but also we engaged in physical community activity. We used what we learned at school, at our universities, segregated as they were, to develop community programs. And where you are, Bohang, in the Eastern Cape, there are examples of clinics of community development self-help programs that have existed from the 70s and even now under democracy. Very few of those current programs can equate with enabling people to do things for themselves. So we began to restore a sense of their own agency, taking away, ridding people of that fear. And fairly quickly we realized that because the system was one that was ever present, spies were everywhere in our ranks and watching us all the time, we felt that we needed to encourage people to think politically about their emancipation. And part of that was the psychological area, which we spent a lot of time on, because our belief was when victory happens, you cannot have half human beings at the rendezvous of victory. And sadly, with the government in place, most of those persons came from exile and actually escaped the conscientization of the Black consciousness period. And therefore, parts of the mess that we see now are attributable to their inability to recognize their own selfhood, their own equality. They'll speak about it, use flowery English, but deep inside they haven't integrated a sense of self. That kind of activity was important. We also had security police and other infiltrations and careful watch over us. We were banned. When you mentioned that I was banned when I was 22, Steve was 25. We were the first 8 Black consciousness leaders to be banned and house arrested. So if you restricted to your apartment between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. the next day, from 2 p.m. on Saturday to 6 a.m. on Monday, you learn to overcome those measures and actually turn things up. And for what we call the system, the police and its apartheid backdrop, we took them on face to face, even though we had very little against all the might that they had. So in showing them up, others began to realize that white privilege and white power was assailable. And hence what has happened in those years to now. Arguably, if it weren't for the Black consciousness movement, we would not have the democracy that we have today.
Definitely. To Vanessa, can she be given an opportunity to ask a question? Okay, and while we wait for that, I definitely agree with the fact that without Black consciousness, I don't believe the democracy that we enjoy today would be what it is. Additionally, I believe with Black consciousness being applied, it would be, we would have a different kind of Black consciousness if our leadership ranks actually applied a lot of those conscientization methods or tools that we have been taught. Sure. I don't know if the floor has any.
There's something from Nebosia from Serbia. What is and what might be the role of internet and social networks in the fight against systemic racism? Very clearly, we've seen, and during the pandemic, when most of us have been in different kinds of lockdown, including a lockdown of the mind and social interaction, we tend to be phenomenally on social media platforms, looking for quick fixes and looking for the latest high that we may get to overcome our condition. And the role of the of online engagement, especially social media, is enormous. In fact, white racists, others who would want to continue our oppression in local, regional, and global contexts, pay huge amounts of money to groups out there to configure algorithms and create responses to the questions we ask. So it's a bot responding to certain issues and putting out words that make many of us shudder, but also imply that you cannot fight the power that we hold in commerce, in thinking, and particularly gender, racism issues. So we on this side ought to be using those platforms more. Now we know we don't have the money to do it at the scale in which they do it, but just putting out simple messages about overcoming fear to interact, that we are the same, that we have the same biology, that the socialization and the education that we've had have brought us to a place where systematic racism still prevails is important. That message is something that all our groups ought to be engaging positively on, while promoting the campaigns that each of us has. And in terms of another question here, how can we socialize and go for a cohesive society if production is socialized while its results are legally turned to profits and privatized? Now, I don't want to get into that area of means of production and who owns what. Safe to say that these need to be constantly pointed out in order to socialize profit gained at our expense. We know also that during the pandemic, there have been more billionaires created, and they've been created out of our fear, out of a few areas of the higher end in terms of combating the pandemic. But in a post-COVID world, we should be gearing ourselves to creating the basis for more compassion, more engagement, more self and other identification, promoting our common humanity so that the divides don't perpetuate. I know that it's going to be quite difficult, and the more we can engage at the social media level, putting out positive messages and showing by example what should happen, the more we will overcome the bigger issues of who is responsible for economic and other exploitation as well.
Definitely. Vanessa, I see your mic is on. Are you going to ask your question?
I was just going to comment on or ask the question regarding poor whites, that earlier designation. It seems that when I'm here in Oklahoma, and so it seems that when foundations and groups of people want to engage to help or support the community, no one specifically says, what about the poor whites? As though there are no poor white people, and the people who are classifying themselves as white and privileged, that's almost whenever I ask that question in forums, that almost goes over their heads. And so I'm curious about that, the psychology of the privileged white not seeing where they come from, if they came from that poor white space.
Isn't that how Trump managed to get to the heights he got with his racism and with his othering? That's because he appealed to the lowest common denominator out there, and despite his superciliousness, managed to create a following that is greater than anybody else before him. If you look at the 74 million people who supported him, you'll find that a large number come from that kind of group that assailed the Capitol building on the 6th of January this year. And when you speak to many of them, and they've been interviewed in different kinds of spaces, their understanding of what was happening is so basic, is so devoid of reality, because people are consumed with a sense of their own survival. And if they find a savior on a white horse, in this case a Trump, they will tend to follow him. So we've got to unpack the kinds of gaps that have existed in our societies and in our politicization, and how we are all in this together. The more I live in my castle on a hill, and the more the shacks surround that castle, my castle is worth very little. But most of us don't think in that way, you see. Mm-hmm. We want to equalize it in some miraculous way, or we want to take the easy route. And there's no easy route to ensure that all of us are safe, all of us are able to not merely exist, but to fully be in society. And that requires changing our education system. It requires an education from kindergarten level that says we are the same biologically, that external representations mean nothing. In fact, all of us have the same ingredients. That respect starts with self and continues from there. Being affirmed as a Black person cannot mean the negation of anybody else. And so on. But that education, that socialization is critical. No amount of top-down, throwing a little bit of money at the problem at the higher level and not dealing with the huge bell-shaped curve of the majority is going to solve what we confront. And that includes violence against women, children. That includes the onslaught psychologically and the physical improvement for a minority while the majority is unable to go beyond eking out an existence. So yes, there's that poor white problem, and remarkably, it's alive and well and in the United States. I think many of us not living in the United States were struck by those pictures coming from television outfits in the United States, showing huge queues of cars lining up for food parcels. That's in the US of A, the largest consumer, where the majority were unable to survive within weeks of the pandemic. That question that was raised about means of production becomes very important then, because we still think that a few oligarchs operating in different places in our countries will become the saviors. Yes, they will provide foundational support for our enterprise, but do they impact society? Do they impact the broad mass of people out there? And the answer to that has to be no, because they just do the cherry on the cake, and the cake is still rotten. And that's the problem we have to confront. So it's back to basic education and socialization, starting at a very early level.
Definitely. Definitely agree with that about education. Thank you for that, the responses, the questions, and for the presentation. I would like to now move on to closing the session. If there aren't any other questions on your end, Dr. Cooper, I don't have any on my side.
That's fine.
Okay. And so just to summarize this morning's or afternoon session, really the Black consciousness movement has been and remains one of the iconic movements of South Africa's liberation. We look to it today to continue our path towards liberation, towards achieving true humanity. And as such, we're really thankful that Dr. Cooper was able to share his experience, his wisdom with us today. And I hope that it was as beneficial to you as it always is to me. I can never get tired of learning about the strategies that were implemented, about the thinking that young people, ages 22, 25, were implementing at a time when South Africa was in some of its darkest days. And with that, I'd like to hand over to JJ to continue on today's program. Thank you.
Well, Hanks, thank you so much. Professor Cooper, Dr. Cooper, thank you so much. This was so inspirational and moving, and it's such an important outlook on the theme. And I think it will give us food for thought for months and years to come. I really thank you a lot. And I would like to move on to our next session. Our next section is a global panel called Connecting Past to Present, Racial and Ethnic Discrimination Today. I will just name our participants because our moderator will introduce them. But today we have Liza Lee, Director of the National Public Housing Museum in the USA. Dr. Robert Burt Davis, CEO of the America's Black Holocaust Museum, also in the USA. Mandy Sanger, Education Manager at District 6 Museum, South Africa. And Godefroy Sindayaga and Ferdinand Indairagishe, apologies if I mispronounced, legal representatives of Forum pour la Mémoire Vigilante, a Burundi-Rwanda organization. And our moderator for today is Shirley Gunn, the Director of Human Rights Media Center in South Africa. Born in Cape Town in 1955, Gunn grew up as an eyewitness to the injustices of apartheid. As a young woman, she worked as a nurse before turning to social work. While a student, she joined the African National Congress and later the MK, the armed wing of the ANC. As a result of these anti-apartheid activities, Gunn was arrested in 1985, detained without a trial, and held in solitary confinement for 113 days. In 1990, she was again arrested after being falsely accused of bombing the headquarters of South African Council of Churches. Gunn was detained with her infant son on deplorable conditions. When she made a formal complaint, her son was taken from her and recordings of this weeping were used to coerce her to confess. While he was returned to her, they were soon transferred to Caledon Women's Prison, where they spent, in Gunn's words, 68 days in hell and anxiety. When it was discovered that security forces were responsible for the bombing, Gunn filed a civil court case charging defamation and won a settlement for the trauma she and her son endured. She went on to testify about her experiences to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, the TRC, and is now the director of the Human Rights Media Center, a coalition member in South Africa that advances human rights through the collection and dissemination of victims' narratives. She has partnered with the coalition multiple times over the years, leading body mapping workshops in Liberia in 2010 and 2012, in Kenya 2012, in Uganda in 2016, as well as in Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Sri Lanka in 2017. Shirley, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you and to give you the floor to lead this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Gégé. And I will turn on my camera. Previously, you saw a sculpture, and this was a sculpture made by Harun. And it's the story, a District 6 story of a woman who describes her experience in the gardens of Cape Town in her Sunday best. I remove that now so you can see me in flesh. This has been rather a wonderful and timely discussion, digging deeper into race. And I will go straight into I think that's what you want of me, Gégé, to go straight into our panel. Am I correct?
Yes, Shirley, you can follow the sequence you would like to follow, and it's okay. It's perfect.
All right. Okay. Well, I think, you know, it's today's introduction by Saths was very important, looking also at how we need to look at how racism manifests in our daily lives today. Is it a thing of the past? No, it's not. It's present. And for God's sake, let's do our best that it doesn't pervade our future and the future generations. So here we are. Having really studied yesterday and connected with the interconnectivity of all these aspects of discrimination. And there's race, there's class, there's religion, there's culture, there's discrimination against Indigenous people, there's regional discrimination. Indeed, there's the globe we have to look at and how the North looks down on the South. So there are all these that interconnect, and we need to keep the whole in mind as we discuss discuss the program of today. Liza is our first. I'm pulling up. Is this okay? I'm pulling up a document because I don't have a printer at home. Is it okay that I do that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
Go ahead.
You know, can I be honest? I'm not very good at this whole long bio thing, but let me just quickly give you a thumbnail sketch of Liza Lee, who has a BA from the Brian Maurer College and a PhD at Duke University. Liza is a cultural activist and director of the National Public Housing Museum. She has served as the director of the UIC School of Art and Art History, where she is an associate professor of art history and gender and women's studies. Fantastic interconnection. She was most recently the 2017 co-curator of Open Engagement. As the previous director of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, she oversaw a renovation of the house, installed a new permanent exhibition, and reinvigorated public program at one of our nation's, that would be America's nation's most important historic sites. Liza is also the co-founder of the Public Square at the Illinois Humanities Council, an organization dedicated to creating spaces for dialogue and dissent and for reinvigorating civil society. She writes broadly about arts, culture, diversity, and aesthetics and politics, and serves on the boards of the American Alliance of Museums, Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life, 3 Arts, and the Rebuilt Foundation. So Liza Lee will be our first speaker on the panel, connecting past to present, wish so, past to present. Oh, just one. Is this a Freudian slip, Saths? Past and present. Racial and ethnic discrimination today. Over to you, Liza.
Thank you so much, Shirley, and thank you so much to the Sites of Conscience. I'm not sure. Okay, great. Thank you. I have a lot of different slides today, and so I will rely on you whenever I say slide to sort of change it. Yeah. So today I am talking to you from Chicago, a city whose name is derived from the Algonquian name, which means river with shores lined with wild leeks. Chicago is home to many indigenous nations, including the Three Fires Confederacy, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa people. Following settler violence culminating in the Black Hawk War of 1832 and the 1833 Chicago, many indigenous people were forcibly removed from these territories or killed. Over a century later, under a different set of government policies called the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, many indigenous nations found themselves once again coerced to move, but this time back to the urban centers where their ancestors were originally dispossessed. Today, Chicago has the third largest urban Native population in the United States, with more than 65,000 Native Americans in the greater metropolitan area. As part of an effort to understand this violent history, and as a museum telling the story of public housing residents, we strive to honor this place we inhabit and make meaningful connections between all forms of forced migration and displacement. Can I ask Yeji or someone on Sites of Conscience, still seeing Shirley as being pinned, but I just want to make sure that it's maybe just, is it just my screen or is this,
we are seeing you, Lisa.
Oh, you are. Okay, good. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, cool. That's all right. Don't worry. All right. So when Daniel Burnham, the urban planner, was almost finished with his masterpiece called the 1909 Plan for Chicago, he went to visit Jane Addams, the well-known social reformer and peace activist, at the Hull House settlement, now the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, a site of conscience that I once directed. Burnham traversed to the west side in what was at that time the heart of Chicago's working class and immigrant populations, and also the place of the most overcrowded and dangerous tenements, to ask the single unanswered question about his perfectly laid out city. Where do the poor people live? There were absolutely no provisions for housing. Absolutely none in this ambitious effort to make no little plans. His effort to reimagine a rapidly growing city was, after all, a proposal to beautify and improve efficiency in business and commercial enterprises. In 2000, the Chicago Housing Authority launched an even more ambitious effort called the Plan for Transformation, with a massive $1.6 billion budget funded for the most part by the federal government's Hope 6 program, an acronym for Home Ownership Opportunities for People Everywhere. The plan proposed a fundamentally new approach to public housing in Chicago. One of the first actions was the bulldozing of 11 high-rise public housing developments that, when demolished, represented the largest net loss of affordable housing in the history of the United States. Say their names: Robert Taylor Homes, Henry Horner Homes, Ida B. Well Homes, Jane Addams Homes, Grace Abbott Homes, Harold Ickes Homes, Stateway Gardens, Randolph Towers, Loomis Courts, Robert Brooks Homes, and Cabrini Green. These names conjure feelings and thoughts in the popular imagination, usually not of the vibrant communities that live there, nor the people who formed imaginative and complex networks of support and long-lasting friendships, but of stereotypes of what it means to be poor and Black in America. Due to a long, deeply racialized history, public housing and the people who live there have been regarded with deep suspicion and resentment. In the prevailing ahistorical narrative, public housing is a failed social policy. But a brief history reveals that the National Housing Act of 1937 helped to build subsidized housing for millions of working class Americans devastated by the Great Depression, and that at one point, the US government's mandate was to provide, quote, a decent home and suitable living environments for every American family, the exact words in the National Housing Act of 1949. Scholars like Ben Austin, Rhonda Williams, Audrey Petty, and Richard Rothstein, and the oral histories of public housing residents and poetry and art bear witness and provide counter narratives and the analysis for us to recognize the histories of resilience and resistance, of innovative entrepreneurship, of care and generosity, of women's leadership on the one hand, and on the other hand, systemic racism and economic injustice that informed failed public housing policies. This includes police acting with impunity, chronic disinvestment, and crumbling and unsafe buildings due to deferred maintenance. Explicit government policies at the local, state, and federal levels worked to ensure segregation, and ruthless policies of redlining, racially exclusionary mortgages, and then racially predatory housing policies and inequities around education, health, labor, and policing all contributed to the creation of an almost exclusively African-American population in public housing in Chicago and in many cities in the United States. It is true that the Plan for Transformation and other urban renewal plans in the United States sought to deliberately disrupt entrenched patterns of segregation and concentrated poverty and address crumbling buildings. At the core, it was also an ambitious experiment of social engineering called mixed income housing that integrates public housing residents into the larger social, economic, and physical fabric of our cities. It is, however, not clear why or how the idea of people living in poverty, living next door to people with money, became the solution instead of actually alleviating and addressing the root causes of poverty. It is clear that by creating mixed income developments and a voucher system for long-term rent subsidy contracts in privately owned developments, cities across the United States intentionally shifted much responsibility for housing and management to the private sector. Housing as a commodity in the market economy in the private sector versus housing as a right and a basic necessity. These are two notions deeply at odds with one another. The fundamental focus of master plans are on places, not the people, certainly not people of color nor poor people. These are the people who are all too often in the way of redeveloping places. And so these are the people who become the collateral damage in the urban planning process. Early studies have shown that these plans for renewal have devastatingly contributed to the so-called Great Reverse Migration of African-American people, scattered, displaced, forced to migrate, and dislocated from the places they call home. This is a pattern that has been repeated all too often over and again. And as the author James Baldwin astutely and painfully observed after the urban renewal policies of the 1960s, urban renewal means Negro removal. Housing insecurity is one of the most persistent and urgent challenges for the majority of city dwellers. The impact and reverberations of over a century of racism and disinvestment in public and affordable housing for everyone is something that our city and other cities across the country need to vigilantly question, explore, and demand accountability for. The root of the word accountability refers to storytelling as an act of giving an account. And the MPHM is a space where never again will a single story be told as if it is the only one. There are two great challenges to addressing the housing crisis. One, a lack of federal funding, and two, a lack of public will due to a combination of misunderstanding and stereotypes about public housing and the people who live there. But the forces we face are not as strong as we think. They are held together by fictions, and they can be disassembled. And our theory of change as a site of conscience is that we can change the mainstream narrative. We can influence the public will and unleash our radical imaginations. When we first were envisioned as a museum, many people and most of the media would ask questions like this one on the screen. Who the hell is going to go to a public housing museum? Can you change the slide, please? I am proud to say that after a decade of work, we were recently called the Museum of the Future for the ways that we are reimagining what it means to be a civic anchor. And today, I want to share with you some of our efforts to dismantle systems of racial and economic injustice. Slide, please. Although we are a museum of public housing, we are as much about the history of housing as we are about the history of our troubled relation to the public good. And the history of public housing is as much about housing as it is about the history of public sphere and the importance of a commonwealth where we can all make claims and thrive. Slide. The museum will be located in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes that was built in 1938. Slide, please. In the wake of urban renewal plans, housing residents joined by scholars, activists, and preservationists, and many others to create a museum that will be a place to preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place where they can live and prosper, a place to call home. Slide. Residents organized to save the building from demolition and to create a site of conscience. Slide. A site of resistance against erasure and forgetting. Slide. A site to ask critical questions about history and unleash our imaginations for the future and to create solutions, to bridge creative storytelling with innovative public policy. Slide, please. A site to forge a collective future that is better for all of us, which is a world where housing is a human right. After an 8-year struggle, we finally own the building and a 99-year lease of the land for $1. Yay! Next slide, please. We also work in solidarity with a capacious public. This is our building. Next slide, please. We, for example, teach classes in Stateville, a maximum security prison in Illinois, because in carceral America, while much public housing is being dismantled, prisons continue to be built, which ostensibly makes prisons one of the biggest growing forms of public housing in America. Slide. We are very proud that we have a community benefits agreement with public housing residents, and we have supported efforts in our city recently to push and challenge the Obama Presidential Center to also sign a CBA that would monitor impact on gentrification and make binding commitments for jobs and sharing authority. Slide. Our efforts also include an entrepreneurship work cooperative. Unlike other entrepreneurship hubs that celebrate individuality and independence, we embrace cooperation and interdependence as values with a focus on community and sustainable growth. Slide, please. In the USA, recent statistics have shown that there are 28% of museum staff of people of color, but 99% of these people work as janitors or security guards, some of the lowest paid workers in the cultural field. Slide, please. We are changing that. The National Public Housing Museum includes an oral history archive, which is a collection of diverse and compelling stories of people who lived in and contributed to American public housing spanning from the 1930s to the present. The collection includes intimate narratives that bear witness to an American history that is both brilliantly ambitious and deeply troubled, filled with deferred dreams. The archive documents the histories of those left out of the mainstream record and inspires listeners to discover stories of hope and resilience where they might have only seen poverty and despair. The collection emphasized the importance of marginalized voices and the perspectives of residents at the heart of the public housing story. Next slide, please. We train people through a rigorous oral history program that includes ethical interview practices and recording techniques, and then we offer them a job and a position with the museum as part of our oral history core. Slide. Through the stories we have recorded, we have learned about candy ladies, barber shops, and other informal forms of economy, and stories about cooperatives like this one at the Altgeld Homes, a leading edge cooperative that at one point in the 1960s generated what would be the equivalent of $7.5 million in profit that they distributed to their communities. Next slide, please. We found out about histories of cooperatives like a community-owned laundromat that provided scholarships for public housing youth. Next slide. Cooperative-owned gardens that provided for healthy food when there were no supermarkets in the neighborhood. And next slide. And with residents, we decided that our museum store should be a cooperative owned and operated with public housing residents. So we piloted an effort with artists and working with youth who learned screen printing tactics and techniques. Next slide. And they print our t-shirts and our tote bags for the museum that we collectively sell. Next slide, please, and share in all of the profits. Next slide. We recorded and learned from the history of self-organized public safety patrols. Next slide, like the Chicago Tenant Patrol. Residents came together to redefine what true public safety looks like in resistance to being over-surveilled and living in conditions of police brutality. The CHA Tenant Patrol checked on the elderly, made sure the building was safe, and cared for children. Our museum will have no guards, but will have an expanded Department of Visitor Services and with education grounded in radical hospitality and critical care. Next slide. We've piloted this program with residents who bring their lived experience to their work. Next slide, please. The biggest gallery in the museum is dedicated to telling history through everyday objects. We celebrate the vernacular and the everyday. People of color, women, and people living in poverty have made inroads in telling stories of exceptionalism and stories of tragedy. But white supremacy still holds on homogeneously and defines and makes up the so-called normal and everyday. Next slide. We bring residents together to work with poets. You can just keep going. There's like 4 slides that show this exhibit. So sorry. We gather objects from people's lives and they come together to write the labels that tell this history better than any curator could. Next slide, please. These are some of the workshops where we bring residents together. Next slide. And the next slide. And we were proud when History Lessons was called one of the best exhibits in 2018. Next slide. Our program director has a special title, which is the Director of Arts, Culture, and Public Policy. Next slide. We work with artists to design postcards to educate and advocate for just housing policies like this one that we recently pushed for, a city ordinance that would stop landlords from discriminating against people who were formerly incarcerated. Next slide, please. These were postcards that were part of an exhibit that we would distribute to visitors. Next slide, the slides would be made. We made posters that were displayed in shop windows. Next slide. And we worked with advocacy groups, and the posters were carried in marches and at City Hall. And we were very proud in December when this policy was actually passed. Next slide, please. Our new project launches on June 2nd. I want to invite you all to come to our virtual event, which will be a public hearing about land sale contracts, unjust land policies in the past that have resulted in the stealing of wealth from Black Chicagoans for a generation. And we will be calling for a reparations bill in Chicago to address this history of land sale contracts. Next slide, please. The heartbeat of the museum will be 3 restored apartments, just like our sister museum, the Tenement Museum in New York. they will tell the stories of Jewish Americans, Polish Americans, Italian Americans, and the third apartment will be an African American historic site that tells the story of Reverend Marshall Hatch. And one of the beautiful stories in their oral histories that we collected was that their mother was so committed to education and refused to let them have a television until Reverend Martin Luther King came to Chicago. And then she said you could have a TV, but you can only watch when MLK and Coretta Scott King are on television. And so Rhoda Hatch said that they thought that the TV was called MLK TV. Next slide, please. So in the apartment, not only will it be restored based on the Reverend Hatch family story, but there'll also be a television that shows the scenes of MLK and Coretta Scott King in Chicago. Can you keep going? And just, it includes the next 3 slides or images of King and Coretta in Chicago, their work for open housing, and also the kinds of violent racism that they faced. These are stories that Chicagoans don't like to talk about because we like to pretend that racism only existed in the South. And so in the kitchen, we'll also have conversations about the contemporary state of racial injustice in housing in Chicago. Next slide, please. When, and, you know, keep going, one more slide, sorry. And in this kitchen, there'll also be a special environmental justice exhibit. We noticed when we looked at photos from the Hatch family that there were this similar green paint in every single public housing picture that we saw from several decades. And we started to ask questions about this green paint, and we heard people talk about this green paint in oral histories. Next slide, please. And we started to collect the paint and preserve this paint. And we realized, next slide, that this paint was actually filled with lead. And that, for example, when the young Barack Obama came to Chicago to work as a community organizer and for safe and fair housing, he partnered with people like Miss Hazel Johnson, who was called the mother of environmental justice, and to work against lead paint poisoning. And so a lot of the work that we are doing now is also with environmental justice organizations working to stop lead poisoning and work for a lead-free future. And so that's a kind of exhibit that will also be in the kitchen. Next slide, please. We understand our work to be generative, which means that only that the future is uncertain and the road is constantly changing. Connecting with today's mass movements like abolition and policing, environmental injustice, and remembering everyone's right to a place to call home, whether it is Breonna Taylor to our Palestinian brothers and sisters, is all part of our capacious work as a site of conscience. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Liza. That gave us a lot of food for thought. And I'm sure that many of us are sitting where we are in different corners of the globe thinking, déjà vu, we know this story. And particularly inspiring has been the way you preserved the paint that is lead-filled and poisonous. And, you know, during apartheid, the housing units called socioeconomic and economic housing units developed by local government had asbestos roofs. Oh. Guess what? Asbestos roofs are still used today in our democratic government, which are harmful, very, very harmful. So thank you. It gives us food for thought for resistance. Wonderful to meet you. Fantastic. Keep up the good struggle, the good fight. Wow, very inspirational. Let's now, I presume, we go on to the next speaker. And am I correct? The next speaker. Oh, where's my notice? Oh, you've now covered it. I can't see. I can't. Oh, there you go. Hold on. Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Burt Davis, CEO of the American Black Holocaust Museum, USA. Dr. Robert M. Davis is the president and CEO of America's Black Holocaust Museum, a role he has had since September 2019. Dr. Davis has an extensive background in non-profit museum management, education, and fundraising. Most recently, Dr. Davis was principal of the non-profit strategic consulting firm DRMD Strategies, LLC, and former president and CEO of two lower organizations. I could Dubuque County Historical Society and the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium. He is the former CEO of the Zoology Society of Milwaukee. And interestingly, Dr. Davis has a doctorate in veterinary medicine from Tuskegee University School of Veterinary Medicine and a Bachelor of Science in Animal Science and Biology from Tuskegee Institute and University. He is a board member of the Association of American Museums, AAAM, and also a board member and former vice chair of the American Alliance of Museums. Dr. Robert Burt Davis, you are most welcome. Please take the platform.
Dr. Davis, we can't hear you. We have a problem with your sound. Now you're muted.
Let me just see here. Yes, Dr. Burt Davis, you've muted. Please unmute yourself. Oh, I can see. We can see. There.
Okay. What about now?
We can hear you now perfectly well. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you, Shirley. I want to start by saying good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending upon where you are geographically in the world. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. I want to first extend a thank you and a hello to Liza Lee, who is a former board member of mine at AAM. She is in my hometown, Chicago. So a majority of what she was talking about, I'm very well acquainted with and familiar with, and understand the importance of the work that she's doing there. So I just want to once again give her kudos and say it's good to see you. We missed you on the board. We missed your voice. But I know that everybody here who's just listened to your presentation have an understanding of your compassion and your ability to sort through some of these difficult concepts and make them relevant to people as it relates to how we need to move forward. So thank you, Lisa. And it's always good to see you. So yes, I will start a little bit about myself. I am a veterinarian by training and found myself in this social and civil rights construct because of the founder of the museum that is illustrated in my background, America's Black Holocaust Museum. America's Black Holocaust Museum was founded in 1988 here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. One of the distinguishing characteristics of the founding of this museum is that it was founded by Dr. James Cameron. Dr. James Cameron is one of the only known survivors of a public lynching in the United States. One of the most Googled pictures as it relates to lynchings is the one that he survived, where there are two men hanging from a tree, and there is this iconic picture and pose of this man pointing to them. He was 16 years old in Marion, Indiana in 1930, and was asked to go for a joyride with some of his older friends who were adults. Someone got shot and killed, and they stormed the jail cell. As you know, the stories of public lynchings in the United States. and they hung the first two adults. They had the noose around his neck and were marching him to the tree. And a white woman in the audience said, "Stop. I know that's little Jimmy Cameron. He's incapable of doing whatever it is you're saying that he did." And there was this ruckus. And finally, the deputies said, "Get out of here." He eventually was detained for being an accessory to the crime and served some time for it. His life was dedicated to the work around race, the disparities of race post-colonialism and post-slavery into Jim Crow, and is the reason that I'm here now. As someone who has worked in zoos and aquariums all my life, but this has been a specific calling for us because the museum then closed in 2008 after he died in 2006. And during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and we are bringing the museum back. And so we're planning to open the museum sometime in late fall or early spring of next year. The mission of our museum is to create a constant awareness of the disparities that has been created because of colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, and what is still lingering in our nation, throughout our nation, even in 2021. Our vision is to create a system whereby people can either physically or virtually now, because of the pandemic and post-pandemic education and programming, for us to talk about these very difficult discussions around race. It has been an imperative for us recently to capture the pulse of America and the world as it relates to post Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. As many, if not all of you know, yesterday marked the 1-year anniversary of the violent killing of George Floyd, and we all are reminiscent of the aftermath of what has occurred, not only in the United States, but what has reverberated throughout the entire world on each continent. It has been brought to the forefront of the disparities still lingering here in the United States. So what I want to focus on now for the next few minutes is something that is really, really prevalent here in the state of Wisconsin, because I'm located here in Milwaukee, in a historically Black community called Bronzeville. And many of you who are in urban cities in the United States or other parts, you do have these cultural communities and districts. Bronzeville typically is associated with people of color, particularly Black people, and it is served as an economic engine, a cultural engine. It is served as the pulse of our community, the successes of our community. So let's go back to the 13th Amendment. When slavery was ended, and the whole purpose and the whole construct, and Shirley, I want to go back to the fact that I believe that your history has been in South Africa. We currently are co-hosts and partners with the Milwaukee Public Museum in hosting the International Nelson Mandela exhibit, which is here in Milwaukee at the Public Museum. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is the first city to host this exhibit. And it is an extraordinary exhibit because it has nearly 170 artifacts. But what distinguishes it from other exhibits is the fact that many, if not all of these artifacts came from either the family or very close friends of Nelson Mandela. And so we've been charged to create and understand and draw correlations and parallels between apartheid and slavery. And as we all know, apartheid was nothing, it was not something that happened in the 1700s and the 1800s. Apartheid started in 1948, and it wasn't economically driven per se as slavery was. So going back to the 13th Amendment, after slavery was abolished, we realized as Americans, now I'm saying we in the collective, not we, that the primary driving financial force and engine in the United States was slavery. That's why we were here. That's how at some point in American history, the city of Charleston, South Carolina was the wealthiest city in the world. It was the catalyst for all the manufacturing that happened in the northern United States. And for the most part, people in control were saying, what are we going to do? So they created the 13th Amendment that basically said slavery was abolished, but there was a loophole. And the loophole was if you were convicted of a crime, then you could be incarcerated. So my focus is going to be on the United States post 13th Amendment and how this has been a systemic and controlling and diminishing aspect of our culture, and which is part of the American tapestry, which is at the pulse of why people are still protesting now based on George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of these other individuals who've been inhumanely killed because of the police, because of the construct that was developed post the 13th Amendment. So the United States actually serves as 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the prisons in all of the world. And most especially during the 80s and the 90s, prison business became as popular as any stock market, any blue chip commodity. If you got into the prison business, you were going to make volumes of money because there was a serious periodic shift in the penal system in building, and Lisa, you referenced this, in the state of Illinois, there was a dramatic shift in building prisons in comparison to building schools or daycare centers or anything that actually could be called a prophylactic or a preventative measure for people to become incarcerated. We just supported the incarceration system. So right now we've got probably close to 2.7 million people in the United States incarcerated. So I'm going to reference a couple of documents that were created here in Marquette, at Marquette University here in Milwaukee in collaboration with the ACLU. Over the past 5 decades, the United States has dramatically increased its reliance on the criminal justice system as a way to respond to drug addiction, mental health, illness, poverty, and other underfunded school systems and the results of the underfunding. Now, I have visited the city of Savannah, Georgia. The first official police department was registered in Savannah, Georgia. As we talk about police reform, we need to understand the foundation of the police system. The foundation of policing in the United States, unabashedly, was to protect the property and the citizenry of white Americans from newly released African Americans or slaves. So the continuance of that perpetuation of us protecting ourselves from them remains to this very day. And that's why we have the scenarios that we are capturing on film, thank goodness, to this very day. As a result, the United States today incarcerates more people in both absolute numbers and per capita than any other nation in the world. Millions of lives have been upended and families torn apart, specifically because of our penal system. This mass incarceration crisis has fractured American society, damaged families and communities, and wasted trillions of taxpayers' dollars. Mass incarceration is a result of many systems failing to support our communities. To end it, we must develop policies that better address the inadequacies throughout our education, healthcare, and economic systems, to name a few. Now, we all want to live in a safe and healthy community and environment. And our community justice policies should be focused on the most effective approaches to achieving this goal. But the current system and the previous systems have failed to do this. It's time for the United States to dramatically reduce its reliance on incarceration and invest instead in alternatives to prison, including approaches better designed to break the cycles of crime and recidivism by helping people rebuild their lives. So Wisconsin is one of the states, more specifically, Milwaukee is one of the states that has a zip code, and I'm going to say this again, I'm going to repeat it, a zip code that has the largest incarceration rate in the United States. In 2017, Black adults in Wisconsin were imprisoned at nearly a 12 times the rate of white adults. Let me repeat that, 12 times the rate. The number of American Indian / Alaskan / Native adults in Wisconsin prisons increased in Wisconsin by nearly 50% between the years 2000 to 2010. The number of people over 50 years old in Wisconsin prisons increased over 250% between 2000 and 2016. Black people, as it relates to incarceration in Wisconsin, has become a profoundly disparate impact on Black communities. This, once again, ladies and gentlemen, is systemic. In 2017, the imprisonment rate of Black adults in Wisconsin, parenthetically, roughly 3,700 per 100,000 people, was nearly 12 times that of white adults. In 2014, Wisconsin had the second highest rate of disparity between Black and white imprisonment in the entire country, the second highest. Although they made up just 6% of the state's adult population, African Americans were 41% of the prison population in Wisconsin in 2017, which means approximately 1 in every 14 Black adults, especially men, were in prison. This also is assimilated and associated with other ethnic groups, especially women and Native Americans, because of the Native American population that Lisa illustrated as relates to the indigenous population of Chicago. That same indigenous population, including the Potawatomis, was here in the state of Wisconsin, specifically in the Milwaukee area in southeast Wisconsin. In every state, we found reducing the prison population itself did very little to diminish the racial disparities. So this is something that we need to take a holistic approach around, this systemic discrimination of people, placing them in situations where they're incarceration, and is not the only solution. As a matter of fact, it's not the solution. Once again, it's the preventative measures that we must employ and the stereotypes. So let's go back now to Jim Crow, The Birth of a Nation, which was popularized, even shown in the White House by one of our presidents, that created this imagery of African-American men as these beasts and these monsters. Even someone who I have a high regard to, and that's Hillary Clinton, talked about the falsely accused young men in the United States in New York, in Central Park, as super predators. There's this stigma as relates to African-American men, especially, that has transcended time, but still is a continuation of our impressions of African-American men now. It is still part of this systemic racism, which leads to this systemic incarceration. Wisconsin's prison population experienced astronomical growth in recent years. Between 1980 and 2016, Wisconsin's prison population increased more than 5-fold. Parenthetically, that's about 456%, to more than 22,000 people as of December 2018. More than
Dr. Robert, may I just ask you to try and get to some conclusion? All the material that you're presenting and the facts that you're presenting are so critical, but just now we're going to be overwhelmed.
I'm sorry. Yes, I will come to some points of how we could possibly come to some resolution.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm sorry with overwhelming you with these facts, but they're just so pertinent and they're so relevant. So I apologize, and I seek your sympathy in understanding how profoundly it is this work that we're doing has affected us. So in conclusion, what we need to do in terms of ending mass incarceration, especially in our state, is number one, reducing admissions. We must break our over-resilience on jails and prisons as a means to address societal problems. One of the things that is really, really important here is if you serve time and you're on probation and you violate probation for just the minimum thing, you get sent right back to jail. The final thing is, and I think this is the most important, and that is provide alternatives to incarceration. One of the things that was the tenet of this conversation that I'm providing for you guys with this discussion or this presentation is one of the tenets of systemic racism in the United States is still mass incarceration. So we must provide alternatives to mass incarceration, which is treatment of mental health, employment, housing, healthcare, and training and education, which we all agree is most substantive to our advancement. So with that, I thank you for your time and your attention. I'm sorry I went over a little, and I'll welcome any questions, or we'll hand it back over to you, Shirley, for the continuance of our panel.
Shirley, sorry, may I just, before you go on, 1 second, Dr. Davis, it is so interesting and important, the facts that you were presenting, and we will be pasting the presentations of all the panelists on the Padlet link that we will share with the participants after the day today. So if it's possible for you to send me your presentation in writing, the text that you had, we will definitely share with the other presentations for all the participants. Thanks a lot.
I certainly will, and thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gege. Exactly what I was going to say, because everything you said is so important, and the detail is what we need to know too. We're just limited with time, unfortunately.
And I apologize again.
Really, thank you very, very much. You know, as I listen to you, and as I listen to your passion about where this all goes to, and that with fewer people incarcerated, hopefully some of these prisons will not be inhabited by prisoners. And maybe one of your quests is to convert one of these prisons into a museum.
That has been a consideration. I know there's been a lot of discussion about that across the United States. There are and I'm sure Lisa probably is aware of this, there are some efforts for, and I believe I want to say Pennsylvania, but I'm not sure. I think it's Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, where there is a museum that talks about incarceration, mass incarceration. But I'm not sure, but I think it's Pennsylvania. But the point of the matter is, and I don't want to talk any more than I need to, is number one, we understand it's systemic. And once we understand it's systemic, then we have to create preventative measures that understand that they're targeting third graders as they relate to building prisons in the United States. Your performance, your academic performance, and your overall socialization is looked at the third grade level, and that determines how many prisons they're going to build.
Yeah.
That's a systemic situation that we've got to combat.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We will go now to the next presenter. And can you just bring back the screen of that presenting? Yep. I believe it is my homie, Mandy, but no, Mandy, I don't see my piece of paper, which gives me your background details. Damn it, where is it? It's disappeared. Oh,
okay,
God.
People will get to know me in my book.
Yes, indeed, Mandy. You know, can I give a Gégé, can I give an impromptu introduction to Mandy with us?
Of course.
I don't see this thing has covered up my piece of paper, which gives me all my details of participants. I just don't know what's happened to it. What do you say, Gégé? Can I be impromptu?
Yes, go ahead, of course.
Okay. Well, I think I would like to say about Mandy is a stalwart of the struggle. I think I got to know Mandy in the early 80s. You were probably in the southern suburbs at the time in a school uniform, right? With a mop of curly hair and a strength that was very impressive. And Mandy studied at the University of the Western Cape, which was called at the time Bush University. So it's not the prestigious university in up on the mountain. What did you study, Mandy?
Education.
Oh yes, of course, you've got a background as an educator. You're a teacher, and you're still a teacher. You're still working in the field of education, but through the District 6 Museum, and you've been with the museum for, I would say, donkey's years, for 2 decades.
15 years.
Almost 1.5 decades. And I've experienced some of your programs, which have a very rich intersectoral element to them, bringing and intergenerational, which is really, really important in the conveying of histories from people who experienced the horrors of apartheid, and the younger generation that don't read enough about it in our history books because it's a bit of a blank page post-apartheid. And so it's museums like District 6 that have to carry on that incredibly important work, because unfortunately, both the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the detail of our history, of our dark history, is not adequately incorporated into our educational system. Am I right, Mandy?
Yes, you're very, 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 very good. Thank you.
So you've got a huge responsibility as an educator attached to District 6 Museum, which carries the stories of a community that was bulldozed by apartheid in the beautiful lands right on the periphery of Cape Town. Of course, it had value being so close to the center of the city. And for all sorts of reasons, the apartheid system decided that this community should be erased. But with the activism of the community that Mandy and other people working at the museum have stood by up until today, even our land commission hasn't fully come to conclusion. There's a fight for the return of the original residents to that land. Viva! That is your work. Thank you very much, Mandy. I'm so glad that you're part of this presentation. If there's anything you would like to add to your background, please prompt me.
Well, I think I'll do it in the process of talking.
Super.
Because
Go
think
ahead.
we're going to run out of time. Can people hear me clearly?
It's a little bit low, Mandy. I was going to ask you to speak a little bit louder. It's a bit soft.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to get closer to the camera. So I had a few slides I wanted to share, but I'm not able to share the screen. So what I'll do is I'll just speak to my presentation. Briefly, I think Shirley sort of covered the work of the District 6 Museum. I think what's important to note in the context of this global workshop and the talk about systemic racism is that the District 6 Museum is a project of the anti-apartheid movement. So we're not a project of a new post-liberation government which has a national agenda to remember the past. We an independent community-based museum, and we largely work in community. So we work with a displaced community that was racially divided during apartheid, and then displaced to racialized ghettos in the city, in what we call the townships of the Cape Flats. And I had a few images I wanted to show so that people could understand that. We're currently living in a city, in a democratic country, where people continue to be displaced today. So we clearly see in the present how race intersects with class. And so the work of the museum is not primarily about the past. Our work is very much about the present. We often reach into the past to draw lessons. Another aspect I think that's important to the topic is to understand that District 6 is one of many communities throughout the country that experience displacement, forced removal, and various laws of apartheid. And so often in the work that we do, we find synchronicity with many, many struggles throughout the country, throughout Africa, and throughout the world. And so although we are preoccupied with the history and the heritage and the struggles of a particular community, that's merely a gateway for us to talk and to engage in struggles that are really universal, struggles for human rights and for social justice. And we're very unapologetic about it. It obviously acts against us when it comes to funding in many instances. But the museum has become a place and a site for people who experience forced removals, evictions throughout the world. So our exhibitions largely resonate with more than just the District 6 experience. I think it's also important to note that although we talk about a specific point in South African history when apartheid came in, which was 1948, where the system of race ideology was held together by a series of apartheid laws enacted. We do always in our work emphasize the long shadow of history. So although we're not a museum specifically about slavery, in all our work, we contextualize the way in which apartheid, forced removals, the divide and rule policies of the government rest on a foundation of colonialism and displacement that happens way before apartheid comes in 1948. Often what's not talked about is that the apartheid system was a legal system, very similar to, Hitler's Nazi regime. These were systems and political regimes that were actually voted in power legally. So they didn't come into power through coups. They established an internationally recognized legal system of governance. They were recognized and supported by many countries, particularly the USA, countries in Europe like Britain, France, Germany, etc. And often when people talk about the anti-apartheid struggle and the sort of final years of the death of apartheid, they ignore the fact that internationally apartheid was protected, kept in power. This largely changed in 1976, which brings me to the next point, that a lot of the anti-racism work of the District 6 is shaped by deep historical roots. It's a pity I missed Saths Cooper's input and the previous panel, but I think a lot of those of us who work at the District 6 were very influenced by the Black consciousness movement. So for instance, I started my high school years in 1976. And so my entire high school experience was about being thrown into the cauldron of Black consciousness and struggles against apartheid education, struggles for equality, struggles against the divide and rule policies that governed all our lives from the cradle to the grave, where the logic of the apartheid regime was to divide the great majority of Black people. In other words, about 80% of the people who were not white. The project was to divide people into a series of minorities. So our approach to anti-racism is very much one of, in our everyday struggles for basic human rights, housing, security, comfort, jobs, dignity. In those struggles, we need to find a common humanity. We need to reach into the common humanity that makes up people in a society. So when we engage in anti-racist struggles, we're always seeking out alliances amongst those who have been artificially divided by the idea of race, which links to the second historical strand that has really impacted on the work at the District 6 Museum and how we view anti-racism, and that is that Cape Town particularly has a very long history of what is called radical non-racialism. And this is an idea that debunks the very idea of race and refuses to accept the idea that human beings can be sorted and organized in race. This does not go against our view, however, that color and race does matter in the present, because it continues to be invoked by those in power to divide us. And I'm reminded of the great Toni Morrison's work, where she talks about how while race and racism is important to engage with and write about, we must be careful not to be distracted by race in our struggles for, human rights for all. And often we see how those in power, when necessary, will invoke either race or religion to distract us from what really matters.
Andy, can you draw your last points and then come to the conclusion, please?
Okay, and so I think some of the challenges we face, I think in sort of our anti-racism work is what is often called the white savior mentality that still dominates in the world. And this is not necessarily kept in place just by people who are lacking in complexion. It's also kept in place by people's self-hatred, by the way in which the trauma of apartheid has affected people's sense of self and sense of agency. So a lot of our work is about creating the museum as a space of healing. Although the museum has become very much part of the international tourism route, our primary focus at the museum is creating exhibitions and performance programs and education programs that primarily involve local communities who continue to be marginalized in South Africa. And so the tourism element, the way our exhibition is designed, often creates discomfort for foreign visitors. Whereas for people who experience apartheid, when they enter into our museum, they enter into a space that is largely designed like a memory box. It's not designed by experts. It's designed by those who are experts, who are academics, who are intellectuals, who have designed the exhibition in the company of those people who were displaced. So a key element of our anti-racism work is that through people discovering their sort of reconnection to their past, that in that process, they also find healing, but they also discover their agency and their important role in solving some of the current problems we have. I think Shirley also mentioned that a lot of our work is intergenerational. I'm going to rush through this now. We recognize that the experience of racism is not a singular experience. There are many manifestations of how racism gets rooted in society and takes effect. We share some of those experiences with communities in the United States and other parts of the world, like incarceration, etc. And I think what is very, very important that in our current work against racism, it is very embedded in community. So we are involved in current campaigns against evictions, against, the right to the city. And yeah, we're very much part of reimagining the city processes. So for us, an anti-racism struggle is not something that needs to land in communities like a UFO, pre-packaged, all nicely shaped and very often overproduced. Instead, a lot of our anti-racism programs we develop with communities and in community, right down to the kinds of activities. So it's very much a learning by doing process. And we find that that organic way of engaging in community contributes to people finding their agency and also contributes to the organic strengthening of communities and their resilience to engage in brave spaces rather than safe spaces, or rather our safe spaces are brave spaces where we welcome contestation, we welcome difficult conversations. So I'm particularly personally very perturbed by the way in which, cancel culture has taken shape in the United States, whereas we confront a lot of those difficult, we deal with racists amongst us, and we welcome them into the space so that we can deal with a real problem in the real moment. So thanks, Shirley. I tried to just cut across what I was going to say.
Honestly, both you and Robert Burt Davis, thank you for And I'm very sorry that we're having to limit your inputs. Very important they are. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you for your courage and your longevity in this endless struggle. And I think what you're saying too is that you connect to the daily struggles, which makes this museum relevant. The work of the museum remains relevant, and that's very important. It's not only about the past, it's about the present and the future. So thank you very much for that way in which you've described your work. Very inspirational. And it comes to a point that Robert Burt Davis made, Mandy. I'm not too sure if it rung anything in your ears, but when I heard about the exhibition that you're going to be having there with, I think, 170 artifacts, probably with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, probably, I'm not sure, but and making the links between apartheid and slavery, I just wanted to make very, very clear to you that we struggled against racial capitalism. It was not only the apartheid that we fought, it was racial capitalism that we fought. And so I hope
that was my last section, Shirley. That was the last section of the indivisibility of our struggle, and the fact that race was merely the manifestation of how the resources of the country were raided and placed in the hands of a minority. They were able to generate cheap labor very rapidly through the sort of practices of racializing the great majority of the population.
Yes.
So we had super exploitation. It was at the service of capitalism.
Exactly. So this might be a conversation that we can have again, and the synergy is here, but I need to proceed to the next speakers. And I think it's a joint presentation, I believe. And like Vanessa yesterday, who apologized for perhaps pronouncing names incorrectly, I would probably like you to actually tell us how you pronounce your surnames, both of you, Ferdinand and Godfried. For those of in different parts of the world, Rwanda and Burundi are neighboring countries. It looks like it's in Central Africa, but it's actually in East Africa. And we've got the people, two people who work with a forum for mémoire vigilante. It's a French word. So both Ferdinand, who has a legal background and represents the people from this particular NGO, and assumes primarily responsible for FMV, that is the acronym for the Forum for Mémoire Vigilante, for the primary responsibility for FMV's external relations, and notably through humanitarian diplomacy. He works to help refugees, internally displaced persons, returnees, and immigrants because of conflict to regain their dignity by refusing to be passive victims of violence. Through memory, the FMV educates its audience to reject violence by remembering the sufferings of the past, to live the present by combating the experience of the painful past, and to build a better future on the foundation of the never before seen thing. That's a very interesting concept. It made me think very hard. Never before seen thing. The FMV helps to remedy the multiple psychological, social, legal, and medical consequences incurred by the victim populations and carries out activities for prevention. It is a site member of the International Coalition for Sites of Conscience. And let me then, I need to summarize this a bit. So Ferdinand, can you turn on your mic and just tell us how you pronounce your surname? I would say Ndaye Gajie. How do you pronounce your surname? Turn on your mic, please. Ferdinand?
Ferdinand may be on the attendees side of our list. Maybe can someone make him a panelist if he is?
Oh, yes, he needs to come over.
So his name is pronounced Ndaira Gije.
Ndaira Gije.
Ndaira Gije, yeah.
Ndaira
Gije.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
And we also asked him to raise his hand if he's in the attendees because we can't see him.
We can't see Ferdinand at the moment.
Ferdinand is here as a panelist.
All right, perfect.
Okay, good. So your mic, you're going to be speaking, and the other contributor, this is going to be a joint session. Not sure how you will do it as a joint session, but this is fabulous. It's from Godefroid. Whoever did that took away my piece of paper, which gave me the details of the people, so I cannot tell you anything more about Godefroid.
Shirley, let me just read Godefroid's bio. I've got it in front of me.
Okay, thank you.
Godefroid Sindaigaya, he's also a legal representative of Forum pour la Mémoire Vigilante in Burundi, Rwanda. One of the founders of Forum pour la Mémoire Vigilante. He's the Director of Education, Leadership, and Peace Studies in the Forum. Having experienced how leaders with no vision led to chaos in his region, he also founded Sensitive Servant Leadership Ministry, SSLM, a platform that promotes character building in schools, trains and coaches leaders to serve, not to be served, to listen to the people and attend their needs sacrificially. He organized many seminars with the objective of making and raising leaders of integrity. With a master's degree in transformational leadership and a master's degree in journalism, he wrote 2 books, Military Coup and Political Intransigence as Sources of Disenchantment in Post-Colonial Africa in 2005, and La Presse Publique pendant la période électorale in 2013, and many articles on leadership and good governance. He's a teacher of strategic management and a consultant in transformational leadership. In December 2019, he was invited to speak at a conference of men in uniform in the Philippines about how to raise leaders of integrity. He is married to Jacqueline and they have 3 children. So Godefroid or Shirley, I'll hand it over to you so you can hand it over.
Thank you for that. You are most welcome. I'm not too sure who will speak first, but the mic is handed over to you both.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shirley. It's really a great honor to be. And, thank you so much for the coalition to have invited us. So since I've sent 2 presentations, one in English, another one in French. So JJ, what language would you like me to use?
Godefroid, we have the French presentation up, so I think you can speak in French. Just remember to speak slowly so the translator can translate you, and then everybody can switch on to their language of choice.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I will go straight to the point so that maybe I will respect the time frame that is allocated to us. So, comme d'aucuns le sachent, le XXe siècle a été caractérisé par des atrocités qui ont endeuillé presque le monde entier.
In the 20th century, there were many atrocities that there were several contemporary manifestation or demonstration of racism and ethnic discrimination against ethnicity in our society. How these historic system of power have perpetuated and perpetuated the discrimination instead of getting rid of it in the region of Grand Lakes. Yeah, there were many victims who lost their lives during these demonstrations. They demonstrated for one specific reason, is to in the hope of living a normal life, just like everybody else, a life free of discrimination. The consequences are loud and clear. You speak up, you suffer, you'll pay for it. In Burundi, many victims lost their lives when they spoke against racism. I'm sure you're going to ask me what are the roots of racism in Rwanda and Burundi in particular. After Rwanda, after the genocide of 1959, there was it, and
sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Can you go back a little bit? I think if you speak a little bit slower, just because the translator is having a little bit of difficulty, little bit slower.
Yes,
and
please.
if you go back to the previous slide and pick up from there,
Yeah.
just about when you were talking about the roots of racism, you can start from there again. Just speak a little bit slower, please.
Donc, parler I am, maybe you will ask me what were the roots of racism in the region of Grand Lakes, in particular in Rwanda and Burundi. After the politics of division reigned policies of politics in Rwanda during the revolution time of 1959, where the monarchy is a monarchy of auto power. There were several extremist movements, especially in Rwanda. They were formed and financed by the government, and they were arranged so the monarchy Tutsi does not come back to power, to stop them from coming back to power. This the group called Nomahamo Imuzagando were formed and were financed by the current government. Speech of hate speech of hate in radio stations financed by the state. In the radio station 1,000 colons or 1,000 collines.
Le fossé ethnique entre Hutu et Tutsi s'est beaucoup renforcé avec la guerre de 1990.
Tutsi, along with the war of 1959, many Tutsis fled their country and they were attacked in their own country. Since almost 1,000 years, the Burundi formed one people and one nation. The Hutus and the Tutsi lived together in harmony. Each one of them played a role in the society. The different communities, there were marriages from husband married wife or wife married husband from different community. They were given cows and lands. Tutsi married from the Tutsi men married Hutu women, and Hutu women married Tutsi men. They were many that were very intelligent, and they all of them benefited from the same benefits, and the Hutu femmes were qualified to okay, so the Hutus Tutsis were one community that lived together. They married from each other. They played a major role in the society. And there was they got rid of the division and the discrimination. Just like already mentioned, women had the freedom, the Tutsi women had the freedom to marry from the Hutus men without being condemned or it was just simply their right, and were not afraid to do so. The politics, it's just a politics system that is fair to everyone, to the Hutus, the Tutsis, treated everyone the same way. In a newspaper that was financed by the government, the name of this journal is Congola Journal, which means wake up in French, wake up in English. In this article written in this journal financed by the government, where in Article 8 called Wake Up. This article says the Barutu, they have to stop having compassion towards Batuts.
Are we still together with the translator, JJ?
Sorry, Godefroy, I was muted. Yes, you just carry on. Just like I'm asking the translator. Translator, I can hear you. Do you want him? Is it okay for you?
Yes.
Okay. All right. She says it's okay, Godefroy. Just continue going slowly, and then it will be okay. Thank you.
And the Article 8 published in Congola Journal newspaper, a newspaper that was financed by the government, Talor, written in this article that the Barutu have to stop having pity or compassion towards the Batuts. Tutsi inside the Tutsi were handed over as criminals were arrested as criminals. This article in the journal, the goal behind this article in the journal is to do just that, to go after these Tutsis, arrest them, and they're simply innocent citizens, and that's what was done was simply not fair. The government role in the genocide of Tutsi was a vicious role, funded by. Would you please go to the next slide? You stayed stuck in one slide. You have to keep going. Change slides, please. Keep going. Yeah, so I'm way ahead. Would you please go? I've already talked about the roots of racism. Now we need to go to the next slide.
Okay, can we just stop for a minute? Okay.
Attends.
Okay. Cami, I don't know if we need to move on to the next slide.
He said this is the slide he needs currently.
Okay. So Sonia.
Yes.
You okay?
Yes. Okay. Yes, I'm okay. Thank you. Yeah, the slides will help too when we're looking at the right slide. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to ask you the favor to call the slide. When you want her to change the slide, you can say, please pass the slide.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So that is the slide actually that.
This is the correct slide now. The war of 1990, it means the war that took place in 1990, many Tutsis who fled the country wanted to come back to their land, to their country. They were doing everything possible through dialogues, through using all diplomatic chains to be able to come back to their country. And the government said, sorry, you don't have the right to come back. You left Rwanda, you cannot come back. This is back in 1990. Yeah. The gap, the division between Hutu and Tutsi during that time became even bigger. The government continued accepting and promoting the messages of hate against the Tutsi population inside and out. The Tutsi women are qualified. The Tutsi women were considered infidel if they married with the Hutus men. There's just so much hate towards the Hutus women. Since 1990, the Tutsi.
Just a minute, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt again. Godefroy, I think it's better if you speak in English. I think there's a little delay with the translation. Can we switch on to English, even though your slides are in French? I apologize, but I think it would be better for everybody listening.
Yeah, yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm also concerned about the depth of the analysis here, which is going to take a lot of time. So just try and also speak slowly, but maybe elevate it to a little bit of a summary.
All right, I'm going to go straight to my presentation in English because I do have the two presentations. So I will go. Okay. The role of the government in the genocide of the Tutsi was an unparalleled role, which was materialized by censorship in schools, a mono-ethnic army, a mono-ethnic police. Very few Tutsi reached secondary and higher education. marking of ethnicity on identification cards, the policy of ethnic quotas in the administration. So there are some domains in the administration that Tutsis were not allowed at all to serve. Ethnic statistical surveillance in all areas of the national life, discrimination in access to public functions, arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, enforced disappearance, to name but a few. All of those were done by the government. So go to the next slide, please. So next slide. All right. So what was the result? The result of all this, the consequences. The consequences are that 1,070,000 people and 074 and 17 people, genocide of victims of genocide were declared, while 934,218 are the ones that have been killed during the genocide. And these are counted, have been carried out in July 2000 by the Ministry of Local Administration and Social Affairs. So the other consequences were that thousands of widows and orphans of this genocide are still here and visible. Disabled people of the genocide are so many. Physical and moral psychological injuries, the feeling of loneliness in the hearts of survivors and victims. Here, you may find that there is one person whose entire family has been killed, and she's alone or he's alone. So you may feel how she's now feeling. So the social fabric has been really broken. Thousands of refugees have been going all over the world, and also thousands of prisoners. Next slide, please. So the bad thing that is now happening is this fact of genocide denial. So genocide denial actually began during the genocide itself. Bodies were thrown into mass graves to fortify all traces. Bodies were also thrown into rivers or into mass graves. Mass graves are even still found here and there until now. It is deplorable that the denial of the media by the internet continues to this day, and that the diaspora is singled out as actors of negationism using social media. Next slide, please. So this is why the remains of thousands of genocide victims still cannot be found. We also know that witnesses to the genocide are traumatized by their neighbors for not indicating where the mass graves are, for fear of being investigated as to who allegedly killed them. So property of genocide, of some survivors of genocide, are still or have been reported that they have been vandalized. Their cattle are slaughtered. So we also notice desecration of the monuments of the genocide. These are facts that they are really people who are still denying genocide. There is also a reluctance to commemorate the genocide by certain groups of people. Next slide, please. So we may ask ourselves, why are still crimes of genocide even today? So brothers and sisters, in our view, the genocide ideology has been spread and gained ground in parts of Africa and in the world, and no one there to denounce. So some governments have been made more responsible for protection against genocide, when in fact they are accused of having committed crimes of genocide. So a hatred of genocide survivors is still noticeable in the countryside until now. Some genocide survivors face hatred from some of their neighbors. The legal instruments for the prevention of genocide have been remade a death letter in many countries. In some African countries in the world, the perpetrators of genocide brought the booty that they looted in their country while freeing, and they invested it in those countries. These benefit the protection from the host countries. Yeah, this is so much important in the fact that if someone is accused of committing genocide, that he's given a safe haven by other countries, this means that that country is not really fighting genocide. So next slide, please. So some countries are still reluctant to send perpetrators of genocide to be tried by courts and tribunals in Rwanda or elsewhere. This only encourages the executioners of the genocide. And at the international level, there is substantial evidence that in some countries, killers duly identified through UN-sponsored investigations have gone unpunished and under the full control of governments. And this only encouraged the criminal. The will to fight and prevent genocide is not shared by everyone, as you may also remark it. So at the international level also, there is not enough prevention of new genocide. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, how can we really fight genocide? So in our view, we should name racism and discrimination as such, because they have been a narrative of people saying there have not been genocide, there have been inter-ethnic crimes, they have been so forth and forth. But we should really name a crime by its name. So not to take a detour in qualifying genocide. We should really advocate equality and dignity for all human beings. So this should be really our everyday fight, our everyday struggle. So we should also act together in the prevention of crimes of genocide and all kinds of crimes. We should also continue a continuous education against these people who really are perpetrating ideas of genocide. And also putting all our efforts together so that the crime of genocide cannot happen again. We should also strongly condemn the authors of discriminatory laws. Imagine, innovate new means of combating racism and discrimination. New slide, please. So the prevention of genocide has been the sole prerogative of human rights organizations. This is why we propose that there will be sufficient involvement of businessmen, multinational companies, financial partners, in short, the resolute involvement of the private sector in the prevention of genocide. Because these people, it seems that they have been away from that fact, but seeing at the consequences of genocide, the businessmen here in Rwanda, in the Burundi even, they were the first targets of the criminals. So these people also should be involved in the fight against genocide. Donor countries, humanitarians around the world need to get much involved in education on the genocide. So we propose also that we should produce a unique educational program on genocide and make it available to the community, to young people and states. We should also support and continue the advancement of the prevention of the crime of genocide and inquire the United Nations to help us negotiate with hostile governments to integrate the education on genocide into their policies. We should also try to involve the population in developing real strategies and actions that can be taken at the community level to support and advance the prevention of genocide. Next slide, please.
Good.
So we should also try to make the creation of international genocide prevention campaign for young people committed to the fight against genocide, sensitize the media in the world to become more involved in the prevention of genocide, come together in the regional, continental, and global networking in the prevention against genocide, sensitize the whole world so that the genocide does not happen again, and call on the United Nations to take drastic measures against governments that do not respect genocide prevention measures. So this is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for giving us your ear. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Godfred. It was very detailed. I just want to know if, Ferdinand, can I give you a few minutes just to add on anything?
We have literally 5 minutes that we need to close the session. So I think let's move on to see if anybody wants to ask a question, because we need to take a 10-minute break and then come back for the workshop. So I think let's move. Ferdinand, sorry, but I think we have to move on to questions now.
Is that all right, Ferdinand? Your mic is mute. Sorry about that. Time is against us. Okay, all right. Jeje?
So Shirley, I think you can move on to Q&A or to wrap. I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, all right. Thank you very much. Can you remove the presentation, please? So we can see the other screen. Thank you. That's better. Thank you very much. Great. All right. Very hard histories we're dealing with and grappling with. But thank you very much for the detail that you presented. Are there any questions? I don't see any hands up or questions here in the group.
Can I actually just say that I so appreciated the other panelists, and also I would very much relish at some other point a deeper dive into a conversation about racial capitalism. I think this is such an important issue for dismantling all the systems of oppression, including the issues of genocide that were brought up. And so I think this is a difficult topic that often, especially in the United States, we have a lot of troubles talking about. I mean, there's growing ability to discuss racism, but the linking of racial capitalism together is something which people are very resistant to. So I really do appreciate everybody's comments, and much to think about. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Liza. Thank you. I don't see any hands up. Jeje?
We have a hand raised, Mamadou, so Senator, and
Where's
then we'll need the interpretation, but you're muted.
Oui, bonjour, je me nomme...
My name is Mamadou Boussouriou Diallo Coalition. I'm with the Guinean Coalition. Thank you so much to all the participants, to all the those who presented wonderful work. Thank you so much to all those who work or do hard work in the museums. I would like to know if each museum in the US does address a particular issue, or they all work together, or all museums in the US are integrated together. They all raise issues together collectively, or each museum does address a specific problem. Is there an integration system between all the museums in the US? Do they work collectively together or independently? Thank you.
Question for Liza and Robert Burt. Who would like to start? The interconnection of the work within museums in the US.
I could just quickly say that it's not as collaborative as we wish it would be. The Sites of Conscience, of course, provides a wonderful umbrella to help knit us together. But as Bert mentioned, the commitment to social justice and tying together issues helps us thwart the sort of nonprofit industrial complex, which forces us to address single issues and asks us to knit these things together, so that we all need to talk about incarceration. We all need to talk about environmental justice. And so I think the work of justice, inspires us and forces us to work together as much as possible. Bert?
Unmute yourself, please. Can't hear. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks again. Thanks for the question. So once again, I go back to the most recent incident with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, which has kind of changed the tide of museums acting as interpreters of history, cultural, artistic, into being social activists. And so this is something new for us, because the only advocacy that we typically do is on our own behalf. When we go to Capitol Hill in the United States, whether it's whatever zoo, aquarium, botanical garden, whatever, and you talk about issues that are germane to us. We now have been placed in a position where we have to be more socially active. Our communities of culture are coming to us saying, you guys have the resources, you guys have the research, you guys have the data, you guys have the